Last episode, the NSS and FSOS briefly took over the solar system, before falling to a revolutionary war which ultimately destroyed the Alliance and banished the NSS to the outer solar system. This episode, you'll see whether the NSS would manage to return, and how two small factions started one of the largest wars in CH history. With the FSOS wars over, the factions involved now had to rebuild and recover from the devastation brought upon them from the conflict. In the Arstotzkan Empire, many cities that were affected by NSS terror bombing and damage in combat had to be repaired. St. Petersburg also had to be repaired, which was done with the help of other nations. Some factions didn't suffer much damage to their territory, but as they were new to it, they had to develop from scratch. This includes factions such as Payload and Ubrialand, who was exiled to Aquathia by the Ubrian Empire in the previous war. Meanwhile, new factions started to form from the ashes of the NSS. However, these factions had no connection to the land that they now owned, and the majority of them had incompetent leadership that was incapable of ruling the territory they now possessed. As for the NSS themselves, though they had lost the previous war, part of their fleet managed to survive in the outer solar system, and they hadn't given up yet, and still wanted revenge for the fall of the FSOS. Being stranded in space, and with no connection to the outside world, their political situation was very poor, and with supplies dwindling, they only had so long to recover from the predicament that they found themselves in. However, the rise of many new factions, which had no ill will towards the NSS due to not being involved in the recent conflict, presented an opportunity to them. They believed that if they could gain favour with the new factions, some of them might allow them to return to Earth, or even support them in doing so. Or if it didn't turn out, they could always take over the weak and unstable states. But the countries of the former Third Coalition would not just sit idly by while they did this. After the end of the FSOS wars, the Coalition countries continued to hunt down the FSOS remnants across the solar system, hoping to eradicate them completely. For example, on Earth and other planets, Arstotzka began to destroy monuments and infrastructure built by the NSS, as well as executing the supporters. The Third Coalition forces also moved to other planets and destroyed NSS settlements there. In the outer solar system, the FCT managed to find a part of the NSS fleet and quickly engaged in combat with them. However, most of the fleet managed to escape, though this further proved to the NSS that they needed to act fast, the lack of doing so being one of the main reasons for their defeat in the previous war. After eluding the pursuing space forces, the NSS fleet began to enact the first step of its plan, and began trading resources and weapons with some of the newer factions. Though shortly after the first trades were agreed upon, the former coalition countries enacted a blockade to stop the remnants of NSS from returning. Though the newer factions didn't harbour any ill will towards the NSS, and by extension the FSOS, the older factions, and those who fought in the recent war with the FSOS, still saw NSS as a threat that needed to be eradicated completely. Many knew exactly what the NSS was attempting to do, and would do everything in their power to stop it, even if it meant fighting another war. However, the size of the outer solar system made it difficult to find the NSS fleet, which often hid in the Kuiper belt to avoid detection. Though some of the transports made it through the blockade, it prevented many from reaching their destination, and the NSS saw that their plan to gradually return by gaining favour with small factions would not work out. So they decided soon they would have to take more risky decisions in a bid to survive and return to Earth. Meanwhile, back on Earth, after Arstotzka held a military parade in Grestin to celebrate the victory over FSOS, the new paramilitary organization of AA took over the territory of the SSR. Various other factions, such as IMA, also suffered protests and riots across their country, showing the incompetence and instability of the new factions' governments to control their territory and people. Additionally, these new factions barely had any functional military forces, with factions such as the IMA not even able to develop any form of armoured vehicles, relying on makeshift weapons and local militias for defence. This combination of instability and incompetence was a perfect opportunity for the NSS, who knew that much of their former population that resided within these lands could still be of use to them. In the meantime, the NSS managed to convince a new faction by the name of USF to give them shelter and allow their fleet to rebuild with the help of their resources and facilities. They also began to rebuild Project Star. After some quick repairs, they announced the reformation of the NSS and quickly take over a small faction in Severossia, which got its land after a revolt against IMA. Now with some territory secured, they no longer had a need for the USF, who they proceeded to cut ties with after gaining the land. To attempt to quell the suspicions of other factions that the NSS had the intention to attempt to reconquer the solar system, the NSS states that they want to reintegrate into the international community, and attempt to portray that they want to fix all the issues they had previously caused in the FSOS wars. Though most were unconvinced, they didn't enter a state of war with NSS, and would give them a chance for now, leaving their territory alone. Meanwhile, Firstone was formed by the Bloodworths, and the Papal States were taken under Arstotzkan protection due to the instability in Severossia, in order to prevent another attack on the Papal States, like the one that happened prior to the FSOS wars. Back to NSS, now with territory on Earth, NSS had the facilities and the industrial capacity to rebuild their army, which they rapidly began to do, utilizing the manpower from their newly acquired territory, which began to attract many NSS loyalists from across Severossia. With their army rapidly reforming, and the expansion of their space fleet, it was obvious that NSS was preparing for war, and on the 9th of July they declared war on Payload, stating the reason as for treason, spying, and manipulation of the NSS. The NSS declared war on Payload first, likely to make an example out of them to the other nations. They also believed that Payload was an easy target, and that nobody would come to save them. The ESA also joined the war on the side of NSS, sharing a similar sentiment that Payload betrayed them. However, the FCT then joined the war in defense of Payload, stating that the FSOS is back for revenge. The claim wasn't unfounded. The NSS clearly had intentions to attempt to regain its brief position as the leading world power, and ESA joining them certainly made it seem like a reformation of FSOS was on the way. However, as much as it was possible that there was a plan to reform FSOS, it's also possible that it was merely a coincidence that ESA sided with NSS on this occasion. Although at this point, it didn't matter to the FCT. To them, it was clear that the former leaders of FSOS were attempting to revive the alliance. With the FCT joining the war, it seemed like the FSOS wars were not quite over, and another large war may be beginning. However, with the powers involved still recovering from the previous war, many of their militaries were in bad shape, having not fully replenished since the end of the July Revolution, so the capabilities of both sides to fight a large war were severely diminished. Despite the disadvantages, the NSS went ahead with the invasion, attempting to drop tanks into Payload territory, likely attempting to replicate their early blitz tactics used in the FSOS wars. However, the drop pods were shot down by FCT air defense deployed in payload territory. The invasion of payload was a complete failure. FCT then began to invade the NSS territory in Severossia with an infantry force, and the NSS is unable to effectively defend due to a lack of ground forces. Due to this, the FCT quickly occupied the entirety of their land. With the NSS land occupied, now it was time for the FCT to go after the NSS fleet. The FCT sent out a total of 10 ships to deal with the NSS fleet. Meanwhile, the detachment of the NSS fleet was composed of 7 ships. While the NSS ships were certainly large and possessed a lot of weapons, most of their armament was limited to cannons, and the ships were very long in shape, which made them more vulnerable. On the other hand, the FCT ships possessed a variety of weapon systems, including cannons, missiles, and lasers, and were better designed from a structural standpoint. As for the battle itself, FCT fire the first shots, with bombs and missiles targeting the NSS fleet as they pursue it. However, as they return fire, it's clear to the NSS that they won't win the battle, so they begin to flee. The FCT notices this, and in order to cause the most damage to them, they begin to target individual ships, using missiles to disable key parts of them and pick them off one by one. A vessel from Payload also joins the battle, and together with the FCT, they manage to destroy and damage a few ships, but ultimately the NSS fleet manages to escape. In that time, some more landing attempts on Payload are made, but they're all repelled by the air defense and ground forces. With the invasion of Payload ending up as a complete disaster for the NSS, panic and desperation began to set in, that they had failed at their one chance to return, and in a state of panic, they once again attempted to fire their superweapon, the now rebuilt Project Star, at Severossia, with no particular target in mind. Luckily, the FCT fleet reaches it and destroys it before it manages to fire, preventing any terror attack at the hands of the NSS. With the NSS once again into hiding, and their superweapon destroyed, the war came to its end. In response, ESA leadership states that they thought the NSS had changed since the last war, admitting they were wrong and making peace with the other powers, also stating they will pay compensation for the damages to the affected factions. This shows how ESA had changed since their time in the FSOS wars, and wanted normal relations with the rest of the international community, in contrast to the NSS, which was set on revenge and became outcasts to the rest of the community. With the war over, the territory owned by NSS is given to IMA, which allows the NSS loyalist population to stay, along with some of their leadership. Meanwhile, the NSS fleet and the remainder of their military make a deal to be integrated into the GPR, a medium-sized space-centric faction. The NSS military was allowed to keep its autonomy and receive access to GPR facilities and resources, in exchange for loyalty to the GPR. On the 14th of July, Ubrialand invades the unstable faction of AA, facing very little resistance. During this time, the Severossian continent fell into a state of chaos, with the incompetent new factions in a perpetual state of war and internal conflict. However, Ostotskan leadership still held the belief that something good could come out of it, so it gave half of its territory on the continent to a new faction. Meanwhile, Payload is invaded by Firstone and Ostotska, with Firstone wanting to colonize new land, and Ostotska wishing to regain its core territory. With so much fighting in recent times, Payload doesn't put up much resistance, and surrenders after only some short combat with Firstone. During this time, the FCT disbands, and its many constituent parts become independent, with the main successor to it being the Decresian Corporation of ESP, which was a small space program. However, with its Severossian territory now under the control of yet another new and incompetent faction, it was yet another blow to regional stability. And with the quick collapse of the RTSF, which Arstotzka only gave land to a few days prior, the Arstotzkan Emperor decides that something had to be done. So on the 18th of July 2020, with the assistance of the Arstotzkan Empire, the Tsardom of Severossia is formed, with relatives of the Romanov family which ruled Arstotzka being placed in charge. With the new nation formed, plans are prepared by Arstotzkan and Severossian leadership to take over the entire continent, and finally stop the chaos and instability that plagued it. The next day, increased drug trafficking and illegal immigration causes the Tsardom of Severossia to reinforce their borders. Or at least, that's the official reason, according to their media. In the meantime, the IMA constructs a border wall on its western border. The wall posed a formidable obstacle to Arstotzkan forces, if sufficiently defended, due to its thickness and many guns which lined its exterior. Meanwhile, Arstotzkan forces continue to gather at the borders of the Tsardom, with Arstotzkan and Severossian forces mostly consisting of armoured and mechanized units, with modern equipment and vehicles. They also had good coordination between them. This is in contrast to the new factions they were up against, which only possessed some basic tanks and guns, and more resembled a militia than a professional army. And with a general lack of unity amongst the new factions, it appeared that the war would be a quick and easy victory for the Arstotzkans. With the preparations complete, on the 25th of July, the Tsardom of Severossia declared war on all the states on the continent, with the exception of Ubrialand. Arstotzka immediately joins them. Seeing the opportunity to expand, the Ubrian Empire and the GPR also join the war to gain additional territory, with the GPR joining to seize Europa from ESA. Now with the only relatively competent faction being in a two-front war, the task was even easier for the Arstotzkans. With the war declared, the Arstotzkan and Severossian forces surged forwards, attacking the fractured states with an armoured spearhead with their support, breaking through and causing CUS to surrender without putting up much of a fight. After that, Arstotzkan forces turned their attention to ESA, which was the only faction that really put up much of a threat. As they are forced to divert forces to other fronts, the ESA quickly collapses under the pressure and agrees to give up its territory. With ESA out of the war, then came the task of breaching IMA's border wall, which was achieved with the use of bombers in a combined arms assault across the border, with a rapid armoured assault across the IMA and their military being too slow to react to the shock tactics employed by the Arstotzkan and Severossian forces. A large amount of their forces ended up trapped in an encirclement, subsequently destroyed. As they reached the next faction's borders, RES and KEP surrender, as another offensive begins from the east with mechanized units. Pressure mounting from all sides, both the MOA and IMA surrender. With all the factions in Severossia surrendering, the Tsardom now possessed the entire continent. With Arstotzkan help, this began their long reign of peace and prosperity for the continent. Now that their mission was accomplished, the Arstotzkan forces returned home victorious. As for the losing side, most of them were completely destroyed, except for the ESA, which was deeply humiliated by its recent losses, not only in the latest war in Severossia, but also by its other losses, such as in the FSOS wars. So their leadership decided to make the choice to merge into the GPR. In the meantime, a new nation by the name of Kalinis forms, with their leadership coming from former officers of a few different militaries. Due to this background, they begin working on a good military industry right away, and are welcomed into the international community. A few days later, on the 29th of July, a new faction by the name of NR decides to put on a show of force with its bombers. However, due to technical failures and poor training, one bomber flies off course into IMA territory, accidentally bombing a statue. Luckily, no one was hurt, but the incident is enough to cause the IMA to declare war on them for such an incompetent and reckless action. Kalinis then denounces both sides for the international incident, but later declares war on the NR. They are shortly joined by ESP, the successor to Decress in the FCT. However, seeing the overreaction to such a minor incident, Ostodska joins the war in defense of NR. Little did anyone know that this would be the beginning of one of the largest wars in CH history, with the longest battle in history thus far.